What's up, guys? Welcome back to What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Join me as I dive deep into the Exodus chapter 22 to uncover what it says about trusting your neighbor. Can I figure it all out in one sitting video? Today, we're going to be exploring one of the most fascinating passages in the Bible that deals with our relationship with our neighbors. In Exodus chapter 22 is a treasure trove of wisdom on building trust, reciprocal responsibility, and ethics in our communities. But what does it say about trusting our neighbors? And how can we apply these timeless teachings in our modern lives? That's what we're going to be diving into. Without further ado, let's get started. If we open our Bibles up to Exodus chapter 22, verses 7 to 15. The reading of our scriptures. Suppose someone leaves some money or goods with the neighbor for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house. If the thief is caught, the compensation is double the value of what was stolen. But if the thief is not caught, the neighbor must appear before God, who will determine if he stole the property. Suppose there is a dispute between two people who both claim to own a particular ox, donkey, sheep, article of clothing, or any other lost property. Both parties must come before God, and the person whom God declares guilty must pay double compensation to the other. Now, suppose someone leaves a donkey, ox, sheep, or any other animal with a neighbor for safekeeping, but it dies or is injured or is taken away, and no one sees what happened. The neighbor must then take an oath in the presence of the Lord. If the Lord confirms that the neighbor did not steal the property, the owner must accept the verdict and no payment will be required. But if the animal was indeed stolen, and the guilty person must with pay compensation to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the remains of the carcass must be shown as evidence, and no compensation will be required. If someone borrows an animal from a neighbor and it is injured or dies when the owner is absent, the person who borrowed it must pay full compensation. But if the owner was present, no compensation is required, and no compensation is required if an animal was rented. For this loss is covered by the rental fee. Recognize and read in scripture, and we all say amen. Now let's check out the cross-reference. Look at other verses that may be similar to give us a better understanding of what these scriptures are saying. Looking at Exodus chapter 22, verse 7, it gives us Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 to 7. Let's begin to read. Then the Lord said to Moses, suppose one of you sin against your associate and unfaithful to the Lord. Suppose you cheat in a deal involving security deposits, or you steal or commit fraud, or if you find lost property and lie about it, or you lie while swearing to tell the truth, or you commit any other such sin. If you have sinned in any of these ways, you are guilty. You must give back whatever you stole, or money you have took by extortion, or the security deposit, or the lost property you found. On anything obtained by swearing falsely, you must make restitution by paying the full price plus an additional 20% to the person you have harmed. On the same day, you must present a guilt offering. On the same day, you must present a guilt offering as a guilty As a guilt offering to the Lord, you must bring to the priest your own ram with no defects, or you may buy one of equal value. Through this process, the priest will purify you before the Lord, making you right with him, and you will be given for any of you will be forgiven for any of these sins you have committed. For verse 8, we're looking at Exodus chapter 21, verse 6. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or the doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. We're also looking at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 to 9. Suppose a case arise in a local court that is too hard for you to decide. For instance, whether someone is guilty of murder or or only manslaughter, or a difficult lawsuit, or a case involving different kinds of assault. Take such legal cases to the place the Lord your God will choose, and present them to the Levitical priest or the judge on duty at that time. They will hear the case and declare the verdict. And we look at Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 17. Then both the accuser and the accused must appear before the Lord by coming to the priests and judges in office at that time. For verse 13, we look at Genesis chapter 31, verse 39. If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself. You made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or in the dark of night. That was Moses working for his father-in-law. Okay, so for verses, and that's it. Okay, now guys, we're going to the interpretation. So let's all the scriptures that I'm going to be using is flowing at the bottom of your screen, so you'll be able to take notes and study to show yourself approved. And without further ado, let's get started. All right, guys. So what do we see here in verses Exodus chapter 22, verses 7 and 15? Well, we see there was a law governing the deposit, money, even goods entrusted to the care of trustees, which is our neighbors, for safekeeping. There's no doubt that this particular law governed how money or goods were to be treated and when given over to the care of another person. The great pulpit commentary says this: deposition of property in the hands of a friend to keep and guard was a mark featured in the life of primitive society, where investment were difficult and bankers was unknown. Persons about to travel, especially merchants, required someone to guard it, their property, in their absence. Refusal to return such deposits were rare. Sometimes, however, they took place. The penalty, if a man were cast in the suit, he shall pay double. The penalty, if a man were cast in the suit, he shall pay double. So now looking at verse 7, in the first case, a theft. Now looking at verse 7, in the first case, a thief stole the deposit. If he stole that deposit, and if he was caught, he was required to pay double. I want you to notice how the punishment would have been, I want you to notice again how the punishment will make any prospective thief think twice about his financial risk. I want you to notice this again, how that punishment would make any prospective thief think twice about the financial risk before he committed the crime. The law was a corrective and restorative. We talked about that in the last video, right? So, because he had to pay double. Let's go deeper. In verses 8 to 9, we see the second case. This case was a little more complicated, and that the trustee was the suspect. We see that in verses 8 to 9. The law provided a very orderly process, a very orderly process, a very orderly process. Okay, let's do it again. The law provided a very orderly progression of steps that would help to reveal the truth. Let's talk about that. Well, we see the first one. The first one was this: if the goods were stolen and a hint of suspicion surrounded the custodian, the person, the trustee, the the depositor, the depositor or the custodian would take their case before the judge. Second, the home of the trustee was thoroughly searched for the stolen property or goods. If the goods were found in the home and claimed by both parties, then the court would have then judged between the two parties. If the court had found that the master of the if the court found that the master of the house, the trustee, to be guilty, he was bound by the law to pay double. Again, as in the first case, the the threat of financial punishment was designed to make any thief think before stealing property or goods. It was designed to stop the crime before it began. Now let's go into the third case. The third case involved property that was taken or damaged. Now, let's do that again. Now let's go into the third case, verses 10 to 13. This third case involved property that was damaged or suffered total loss while under the care of a neighbor. The law required the trustee to take an oath that he was innocent and required the owner to accept the oath. There was an exception to this point of the law. What? Let's look at verse 12. If the property or the goods were stolen by a thief, the trustee was to make equal restitution in verse 12. The property was in his care. He was therefore responsible for it. The property was in his care, and he was therefore responsible for it. Also, we see if the property or the goods were damaged by some unpredictable or preventable, if the property or goods were damaged by some unpreventable cause, such as being torn to pieces, such as being torn to pieces by wild animals, and the trustee could produce the evidence, he was innocent in verse 13 that we see. Apparently, laws similar to those the apparently laws similar to those seen in case number 3, verses 10 to 13, were enforced as early as the patriarchal period, which is recorded in Genesis chapter 31, verse 39, that we read in the cross reference. Remember? Let's take a look. If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself. You made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or in the dark of night. So we see Moses was telling his father-in-law that, right? And we see that it was practiced in that time. Also, we see this. Looking at verses 14 to 15, we see that fourth case It refers to a property that was damaged or suffered loss while borrowed, such as an animal being injured or dying in verses 14 to 15. The law provided the following guidelines to be done. Number one, if the owner was not present, the borrower made restitution. Number two, if the owner was present and the borrower was not to pay restitution, the owner was naturally responsible for his own property. Number three, if the animal was hired and the hired money. Number three, if the animal was hired and the hired money covered the loss, the modern day equivalent would be this. If a person rented a machine from a company and the machine broke down while renting it, it would not be the the renter's duty to replace the broken tool. The money he paid to rent the machine would cover the owner's risk of doing business. What is my thoughts about this? Well, my thoughts about this is this. The overriding principle behind these laws was as George Bush summarized, is this. The more these statutes the more these statutes are examined, the more clearly does their responsible, equitable, mild, and human spirit appears. God's law governed the property and goods of people. Had several purposes, though, also. Number one, to protect the rights of the property owners. Number three, to prevent people from damaging property either through negligence or deliberate action, such as stealing or arson. Number three, to serve as a deterrent, a check, a restraint, a prevention against any person stealing or damaging property either deliberately through negligence. Number four, I see to protect the thief from property owners in societies that might seek excessive revenge against him, going too far in exercising punishment, for example, like lynching or rioting. Number five, I see is that the correct. Number five, I see is to correct and restore the person who did steal, who did this. Number six, to build a strong moral and just society by establishing laws that would arouse people to stay alert in order to prevent accidents and damaged property, to think twice before committing a crime, and to correct and restore the person who did steal and cause some careless, irresponsible damage or loss to property. We see this within scriptures. And let's take a look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus says, "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I have come to accomplish their purpose." The Life Application Study Bible tells us this. If Jesus did not come to abolish the law, does that mean all of the Old Testament laws still apply to us today? In the Old Testament, there were three categories of law: ceremonial, civil, and moral. Number one, the ceremonial law related specifically to Israel's worship in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 2 to 3, for example. Its primary purpose was to point forward to Jesus Christ. These laws, therefore, were no longer necessary after Jesus' death and resurrection. While we were no longer bound by ceremonial laws, the principles behind them to worship and love a holy God still applies. Jesus was often accused by the Pharisees of violating ceremonial law. Jesus was there, right? Number two, the civil law applied to daily living in Israel. For Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 10 to 11 is the example. Because modern society and cultures are so radically different from that time and setting, all of these guidelines cannot be followed specifically. but the principles behind the commands are timeless and should guide our conduct. Jesus demonstrates these principles by example. Number three, moral law, such as the Ten Commandments, is a direct command of God, and it is required restrict obedience. See Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, for example. The moral law reveals the nature and the will of God, and it still applies today. Jesus obeyed the moral law completely. Completely. Now let's take a look at Romans chapter 7, verse 12. But still, the law itself is holy, and it commands our holy and right and good. Now let's look at Romans chapter 7, verse 12. But still, the law itself is holy, and its commands are holy and right and good. And let's look at First Timothy chapter 1, verse 8. We know that the law is good when used correctly. Now let's do a brief recap. There's no doubt in Exodus chapter 22 is part of the book of laws and a set of community regulations given to the Israelites after they left Egypt. This chapter is, in particular, focuses on the social and economic relationship within the community, guiding everything from property rights to social justice. It is a powerful reminder that our actions as individuals directly impact those around us, and that our relationships are built on a foundation of trust, respect, and mutual responsibility. So, we dived into the significance of Exodus chapter 22. Firstly, trust in the cornerstone of any healthy relationship. When we trust our neighbors, we create an environment of safety, security, and cooperation. This trust isn't just about feeling good about each other, it's about being reliable, transparent, and accountable. The Bible teaches us that our actions have consequences and that we must take responsibility for our mistakes and make amends when necessary. Secondly, our responsibilities towards our neighbors are multifaceted. We're not just talking about being a good or a friend, or we're not just talking. Okay, let's do it again. Secondly, our responsibilities towards our neighbor are multifaceted. We're not just talking about being a good friend or good citizen. We're talking about a good human being. And Exodus chapter 22 reminds us of that our relationships are built on a foundation of mutual respect, kindness, and generosity. We're called to look out for each other, to care for the vulnerable, and to uplift those around us. Thirdly, the implication of these teachings are far reaching. When we trust our neighbors, we create a community that are more cohesive, more supportive, more just. We create an environment where people can thrive, grow, and reach their full potential. And when we apply these teachings in our modern lives, we become an agent of change, promoting culture of trust, empathy, and understanding. Lastly, in Exodus chapter 22 teaches us that our relationships are a reflection of character, of our character. When we treat our neighbors with kindness, respect, and generosity, we're not just doing them a favor. We're reflecting the character of God. We're demonstrating that we value their dignity, their worth, and their humanity. One of the most striking examples of this is in the story of the Good Samaritan. A man is beaten and left for dead. And it's not the priest, and it's not the priest or the Levite who stops to help him. It is the Samaritan, the outsider, who shows compassion and kindness. The story illustrates a power of trust and reciprocity. The story illustrates a power of trust and reciprocity in our relationships. When we take the time to care for others, we build bridges, we break down barriers, we create a more just and compassionate world. Another example is the lives the another example is in the life in the lot Another example is in the lives of the early Christians who lived in a time great persecution and uncertainty was amidst. Yet they continued to show love, kindness, and generosity to those around them, even when it was hard. They trusted that God would provide. They trusted each other to have each other's back. This trust wasn't blind or naive. It was grounded in their faith, in their values, in their commitment to each other, their commitment to their neighbors. In the same way, when we trust our neighbors, we open ourselves up to the possibility of being hurt, of being betrayed, of being let down. But we also open ourselves up to the possibility of deeper connection, of meaningful relationships, and of creating a better world. When we take the risk of trusting others, we're not just changing our relationship, we're changing ourselves. Some might argue that trusting others is a recipe for disaster, that people will take advantage of us or that they will be hurt. But I believe that's a narrow view of trust. Trust isn't about being naive or blind. It's about being wise. It's about discerning and being wise. It's about knowing that people will make mistakes, but it's also about knowing we can learn from those mistakes and grow as a result of those mistakes. In conclusion, trusting our neighbors is not just biblical imperative. It's a fundamental human need. When we trust each other, we create a world that more loving and more compassionate and more just. So I want to leave you with this. I want to leave you with this question today. How can you build trust with your neighbors, your colleagues, or your friends? Take a moment to reflect on that. And let's continue the conversation in the comment section below. Tell me about it. And if you want to explore more biblical teachings on relationship trust, check out other videos on my channel and check out Proverbs chapter 27. I want to thank you for watching. God bless you. God bless your family, and I'll see you in the next. Thanks.